If you like tariffs and he likes tariffs, fair enough, use them strategically. Pick your targets in a careful way. There's certainly lots of cases where tariffs against China are quite warranted. And there may be cases where selected tariffs against other countries are warranted. But this across the board approach just raises costs for American consumers, raises costs for our manufacturers. There's no strategic thinking. Come up with a strategy. Don't just do this by the seat of your pants.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Ted Alden. Ted is one of the country's leading voices on trade and trade policy. He is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he focuses on competitiveness and trade. He's a frequent guest on news stations such as Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, the BBC, and the NewsHour at PBS. In our broad-ranging conversation, we focus on President Trump's approach to tariffs and trade, what's working, what's not working, the policy's effect on our economy and our relationships internationally. It's a great conversation that I've been looking forward to after speaking with him for years about this topic. Welcome to the podcast, Ted Alden.
Thanks very much, Stan. It's great to be here with you.
So I opened up the New York Times this morning, and the first headline I saw was the following. This just shows how topical. It says, Trump is winning his trade war. What will that mean for the economy? The first couple of sentences are, over the last 6 months, the U.S. has left behind the global trade order that persisted for decades in favor of something drastically different and largely untested. So give us just a quick summary of what the global trade order was pre-Trump, and we can dive in afterwards about what the president's currently doing in terms of his strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of exceptions, but at the 30,000-foot level, the global trade order was a rules-based system that tariffs and other trade barriers were set and removed according to agreements reached by nations. Sometimes these were on a global basis. Sometimes they were on a regional basis, like NAFTA and its successors, and sometimes they were on a bilateral basis. But countries didn't set tariffs unilaterally the way President Trump has been doing. So that's a radical change from the practice reaching back really to the end of the Second World War, and most dramatically since the creation of the World Trade Organization in the mid-1990s.
It would be fair to say that pre-Trump, the assumption on going into trade negotiations was, hey, let's find some mutual benefit between countries. We're not looking for a zero-sum approach. Is that a fair characterization?
It's absolutely a fair characterization. And one of the things I think that has historically made trade negotiations different is the shared belief among nations that there can be win-win negotiations. You know, going back to David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, that the world becomes wealthier if nations specialize in what they make comparatively best. That allows you to have agreements in which countries lower their tariffs on some products and other countries lower tariffs on other products, and production shifts around the world in ways to take advantage of those different rules. And the idea was that there's something to be gained by every country in the system. Again, not something that Donald Trump has believed for many years and has now been in a position to act in a very different way.
Where does that come from? Any sense of the history of why he has been beating this drum for 40 years?
You know, I've tried to trace it as much as anyone, and I don't have a really satisfying answer. The best I can come up with is that his worldview was very much shaped by the economy of the late 70s and 1980s, when the United States was facing very vigorous trade competition. And that's when Trump first began expressing his ideas about international trade competition and the importance of using tariffs to keep out what he saw as unfairly traded foreign products.
So kind of a static view across decades that hasn't really adjusted for, conditions on the ground. Is that fair?
I have not seen it adjust, and I also think his economic views are very much tied to the old manufacturing economy. When Trump thinks about trade, he thinks about steel, he thinks about aluminum, thinks about other raw material products like timber, and he thinks especially about automobiles. And so those are still obviously important parts of our economy, important parts of the global economy, but not nearly as important as they were back in the 1970s and 1980s. His worldview really does not embrace the modern tech economy in any particular way.
It seems to me to be based on, grievances. A common denominator of his policies seems to be, gosh, I or we were treated unfairly and we're going to get even on people. There were unfair trade practices and we're going to get even. Another goal seems to be just increasing revenue. Like we can make money by charging for things, certainly through tariffs. A third seems to be is to eliminate unfair trade practices abroad. People like China, countries like China, have been taking advantage and not following kind of the norms. Do you agree that those are the goals of the administration? And if so, how are they doing?
I think broadly speaking, yes, those goals are not all mutually compatible, and we can talk about some of those tensions. I've been impressed by the work of a Switzerland-based economist, Richard Baldwin, and he's coined the notion, the grievance doctrine, to describe Trump's trade policies. And it really starts from your first premise there, which is the president's sense that the United States has been mistreated by its trading partners. His biggest piece of evidence is the large and enduring U.S. trade deficit, which again is a complicated measure. But for Trump, the trade deficit is a sign that the United States is losing in trade and therefore needs to take a variety of steps to rebalance those trading relationships. Tariffs are his favorite tool. I think his hope is that tariffs will increase domestic manufacturing and reduce imports, and thereby tackle the trade deficit in some measure. No evidence of that yet, but longer term, we could see that. I think the revenue implications are somewhat secondary. Tariffs don't raise a lot of revenue, particularly if they're too high, because then imports start. But I think he sees that as a kind of cherry on the top. Tariffs will have these other benefits, and they'll also raise some revenue, which will allow the Republican Congress to do what they've done, which is to lower taxes in other areas. Again, to be clear, the tariffs don't begin to make up for the losses from the other tax reductions. But yeah, I think what you've put together there is all very much part of the mix of his thinking. And what's quite interesting about this is that a lot of this comes very much from the president's head. He wrote 25 years ago that if he became president, he would be his own U.S. trade representative. Didn't really do that in the first term. In the second term, he's doing it. He's driving all of this. He's leading the theorizing behind these negotiations. And in fact, he's concluding a lot of the negotiations himself personally. So we've never seen a president involved at this detailed level in trade negotiations. Bill Clinton was the closest, but this is really unprecedented.
The headline of the article I referenced at the beginning of this talk was Trump is winning the trade war. My guess is if you're a Trump supporter and you see these countries caving, essentially what Trump's done from a negotiation perspective is started high and ended up somewhere in the middle. The tariffs are still radically, let's say the average is 15 or 20% on a country, even an ally, where they used to be 2 or 3%. If you're a Trump supporter, you'd say that wins. I felt like when he started making those threats, the market wasn't going to like it, right? Because that's essentially going to be passed through to consumers, either through inflation or just higher costs generally. And I remember calling you and saying, Ted, I think the market's going to crash over this. I'm selling my equities. And you said, Stan, I'm selling my equities too. And for a short period of time, we looked really smart. But now the market's back up. So the market doesn't think this is concerning. What's going on there?
Yeah, no, we'll see over the next 6 months. I've continued to be pretty cautious. Fortunately, I sold some of my equities at a pretty good time, but I'm still taking a bit of a hit, right? Because the market's higher than it was when I sold. This is a fascinating historical experiment right now, because what economists have told us for decades and what the leaders of the major economies in the world have believed for decades is that falling tariffs are good for global economic growth, that lower tariffs are mutually beneficial. Not every country benefits equally, but all countries will benefit. We're about to run a very different experiment. We have tariffs that now seem to be settling at the level of the late 1930s. There's every reason to believe that tariffs at that level are going to drive inflation higher. going to slow global growth, and as a result will probably slow U.S. growth as well. But let's get together in 6 months and have this conversation, and we'll see where we are. The notion that he's winning depends on the belief that we are better off in the United States if we have higher tariffs. And that remains a big question mark, of course. That's going to be paid for by U.S. importers. It's going to be paid for by U.S. consumers. It may result in somewhat higher levels of production of certain goods in the United States. In terms of what he's getting from other countries, it's very vague. There are a couple of places where it seems like there have been victories in terms of opening new markets for American producers. The Australians have agreed to remove some of their impediments to U.S. beef exports. Not clear whether our farmers can take advantage of that, but that's a long-standing grievance. Europeans have reduced their auto tariff, it looks like, to 2.5%. That may create opportunities for American exporters, but again, mostly, cars sold in Europe are made in Europe or increasingly made in China, not in the United States. So a bunch of vague promises about investments and purchases. So we'll see how these play out. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that in the terms he's laid out, Trump is getting a lot of what he wants. He's betting on the fact that the U.S. market is so important to other countries and stable relations with the United States are so important. In Europe's case, of course, they're looking at Ukraine and realizing the importance of American support for Ukraine. So I think, yeah, you got to chalk one up for the president. I think he's doing a lot of what he said he would do.
I guess I agree that in the short term, he's had some tactical victories. I think in the long term, you said, let's get together in 6 months. That might even be too short. I think 5 years out, this looks bad is just my assumption. And so I think from a negotiation perspective, he's had some tactical wins, but the damage to the long-term, both relationships and economy, I think is going to bear out. Is my own thinking on that.
Especially on the relationships, right? Well, we'll see on the economic front, right? If these deals prove reasonably stable, then I think the economy will adapt. Producers, consumers can learn to live with this. So if this proves to be, this is Trump's big trade move in the first 6 months of his second term, and things are reasonably stable, then I think the economy will deal with that quite well. If the deals keep getting ripped up and renegotiated, then there's going to be a recalculation. And we don't know. These agreements don't have, going back to where we started this conversation, these agreements don't have any real legal heft. It's not like the old WTO or NAFTA agreements where we, the United States, and other countries really felt bound by those commitments. So these are very much transactional arrangements. My worry is more on your second point about the relationships. So I think, one of the things that has played very much in the United States' favor in the growing rivalry with China, which really will, I think, be the relationship that defines the world for the next 50 years. Our big advantage had been our deep network of allies. And those relationships were a combination of security relationships and economic relationships. And we treated those countries differently. We didn't treat Japan and Canada and Mexico and the Europeans like every other country. We treated them as allies, and that meant that they were treated differently both for economic and for security purposes. Trump has really ripped that up. It magnifies uncertainty enormously. And I think, and we very much agree on this, throws away what I think has been our most precious international asset for the last 75 or 80 years, which has been our close alliance relationships with wealthy, important, and powerful countries. And we are tearing those up, and that's going to be very costly. I agree.
I want to talk in a minute about how much heft we really have. I might disagree with you there. I think we have a lot of power in these relationships. We'll see. We don't rely that much on imports these days. And we'll see how much power we have. But I want to get back to something you said that I thought was insightful. These are one-off transactional deals. The traditional trade agreements, you had mentioned earlier, NAFTA, there are a bunch of multilateral trade agreements that we could point to that are big, complex, strategic, multi-year negotiations. What he's done is kind of one-off. He had his Liberation Day on April 2nd, where he went to, 60-ish countries and said, hey, I'm going to give you a deadline. You got to do a deal with us or the tariffs are X. And so if you look at this from a negotiation perspective, it's not only bullying, what we talked about, it's threatening, it's starting high, hoping to end in the middle. And I think he's taken a very tactical negotiation approach to something that's much more complex and strategic. To me, trade, and I'd love to hear from you on this, is a complex web. I've followed it for years. I followed the NAFTA negotiations very closely. And wow, that's complexity. We need someone like you to explain to us, how good it's been or how bad it's been, and to treat it as a one-off deal rather than a multi-party strategic relationship seems like a tactical mistake from a negotiation perspective. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I would say I largely agree with you there, Stan. I mean, if we look at the agreements that the Trump administration is reaching, they are extremely thin, right? I mean, basically what's in those agreements is some new arrangements for tariff levels and a series of vague promises about purchases of American goods and perhaps investment in the United States. That just touches a small fraction of what moves money around the world, what drives investment, what drives trading patterns. And one of the things we saw with the global and regional trading systems over that 75 years was the agreements became deeper and deeper and deeper in terms of dealing with the myriad of factors that drive commerce. So the global agreements in the 1950s and 1960s were largely just tariff cutting agreements. But then increasingly it got into issues like restraining government subsidies because those distort trade, dealing with the rules for countering unfair trade like anti-dumping and countervailing duty rules. Intellectual property, incredibly important. I mean, companies are very reluctant to invest and do business internationally unless they know their international property is protected. Digital trade, the ways in which digital trade crosses borders is very different from conventional manufactured goods. Questions of where data gets housed and what the rules are around intellectual property protection for that data. All of the modern agreements have gone in great depth into those issues. And as a result, given companies a lot more certainty, if I invest in Central America, or if I invest in Indonesia, or if I invest in the United States for that matter, here are the rules governing my actions. And I know that these elements, which are central to my business success and profitability, are reasonably secure. Given that Trump has effectively thrown all that out, it's not at all clear how secure those promises are anymore. I mean, if you look at the developing countries, for instance, they made a huge concession when the World Trade Organization was created in agreeing to respect Western intellectual property rights. That's not in their economic interests. In a lot of cases, they would be better off stealing patents and other intellectual property. Are all those commitments going to be maintained going forward? And can you deal with all this stuff in one-off transactional deals? So I really agree with you. I think, these very simple deals don't begin to get at the complexity of these trading relationships. And in a way, we're living now off the collateral of the WTO deals and the NAFTA deals and other deals because those rules are still in place. But given that the U.S. has shown it's willing to tear up the rules, one has to wonder how long it's going to be until other countries begin doing the same. Say, hey, you are respecting these agreements, and we have areas that we choose not to respect them anymore ourselves. And that's going to be very hard for business to deal with.
Yeah, I agree. Essentially what you're saying is that in the new world order, because you don't have legalistic things that bind us, we have to trust each other. And who wants to trust someone that just bullied them?
Yep.
I think we're in a tough position on that, and people don't
And
realize.
it reduces the incentive. So, for other countries, and this was true in the United States for a long time, other countries thinking of doing things that may harm American interests, for example. In the past, they would say, look, we're bound by the rules of the WTO or these agreements not to do these things. And they could tell their voters, right, these are not acceptable. That has really been torn away. And so politicians are going to have to use other arguments and say, well, we can't make this regulatory change that's going to hurt American companies because they might come after us in some way. I think that's a much weaker read to hang on. So I suspect what we're going to see around the world is a plethora of actions that in different ways hurt American economic interests. And the administration is going to have to play a kind of whack-a-mole dealing with all these one by one, rather than having a framework of rules in which those things are much more settled.
And the question I'd have is, who's there to whack the moles? You and I had a conversation about who Trump has on his team, who normally is negotiating trade deals and who's doing it now. And it feels to me, I mean, you and I were in a meeting where John Bolton, former national security director, told us, look, Trump doesn't even want an agenda. He just wakes up and comes to us with things. That seems really far from strategic to me. And if you and I agree that trade needs to be you have to have a strategic approach to negotiation, and he's essentially bullying, doing one-off transactional agreements that are going to result in us having to whack-a-mole, who's going to solve that problem in the White House? So give us a sense of who's there and what they know about trade, or is this just out of his brain every morning?
I think it's pretty much out of his brain every morning. And I think, what your question is getting at is that this is an extraordinarily weak team for dealing with these issues. So, as I say, Trump is running the show himself, and he has a whole series of preconceived notions about tariffs and international trade, but has never delved into the complexities in any way. Leading the charge for him appears to be the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. Again, no background in trade. He's a markets guy, learning this on the fly. There was a very good New Yorker piece that suggested a lot of what Howard Lutnick knows about trade he's learned from Trump. So that's not reassuring. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, again, not a trade guy. I mean, reasonably sensible, level-headed guy, but no experience on trade. The U.S. Trade Representative is a young guy, not a lot of experience, understands trade law, but Jameson Greer is not a sort of A-list player. He's clearly subordinate to the other players here. Peter Navarro in the White House, been around for a long time, but again, largely an ideologue, not a trade expert. So they do not have a strong team, and they have not empowered the experts on the USTR staff and in other places. I mean, if you look again at the agreements they're reaching, they're the sorts of things that laymen understand about trade. Okay, our tariffs are higher. Europe's tariffs are going to be a little bit lower, and they're going to buy a lot of our stuff. Okay, great trade deal. If you look at trade deals in depth, they're all about the various regulatory complexities, the difficulties that companies have setting up businesses in other countries, the complications of getting your products through customs, how to cut through the red tape. There's a lot of detail that is only understood by having experts in the government talking to companies, talking to labor unions, talking to trade lawyers, talking to other people who really understand the difficulties of doing business internationally and trying to reach agreements that tackle those obstacles. None of that is happening in this administration. And so they really, the question of can they whack the mole, it'll be really hard, right? I think countries will be very careful if they want to do things that harm U.S. economic interests, to do it in very subtle ways that are hard for this team to understand. Raising a tariff, that's going to be waving the red flag and the Americans are going to come after you. But doing subtler stuff on the regulatory front, I think this team's going to have a really difficult time dealing with.
Right. So another example of, not only are the leaders the wrong people, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, not historically people that are even involved in trade, but the rank and file folks just aren't there. You said to me in a conversation once, you usually know a lot of people in the White House doing the blocking and tackling. And I think what you said to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is I don't think there's anyone there that even understands trade. Is that right, correct recollection?
I mean, some of that is my getting older and living on the West Coast, so I don't have quite the connections that I used to have. But the administration is hemorrhaging good people, right? In the State Department and the U.S. Trade Representative's office and other places, the people who really understand these issues in detail are either leaving or have been fired. And so I think it's inevitable that's going to cause big problems down the road. I mean, there's not a strong China team in this administration, for example, for the most important relationship we have. And it's hard to know where and how exactly that causes problems, but we can say confidently it will cause problems. There will be great misunderstandings, and you won't have the personnel to deal with these issues in the depth that they need to be dealt with. There is an overweening confidence in this administration that these are simple problems that just needed a tough president to solve. And they're not. They've never been simple problems. They aren't simple problems now.
Yeah, I'd say he's taken a simplistic approach to complex problems. So I'm even more pessimistic, I think, than you. Well, let's talk about China. You bring it up, and that's the big, elephant in the room in terms of trade. We could spend a whole episode on this. The best strategy for the U.S. to counter China, whether it is militarily, politically, economically, is to be in line with Australia and South Korea and, Indonesia and Western Europe. If you have those countries as a bloc, it's game over in all of those areas. So we just agree all day long that cutting those relationships and harming them is, suicide. And, let me get your perspective on that. Is China overall, from your perspective, a beneficiary of this Trump approach to trade and tariffs that we both agree is misguided? Is China a beneficiary?
I mean, I think strategically, absolutely, right? Economically, there's a price for China to pay in the short run. It's already hurting in different ways from the reduction in exports to the United States. So there is a short-term economic cost for China that's real, but it's just changed the global dynamic. I mean, you used to have a United States that could say with some degree of truth that it was upholding its international commitments, upholding its alliance commitments, dealing on an equal basis with its trading partners, whereas countries would look at China, look, for instance, at their bullying of Australia, when Australia had the temerity to speak out about the need for COVID investigation, and China began boycotting an array of Australian products. You look at how China behaved vis-a-vis Canada and kidnapping its citizens during the Huawei affair, China's bullying of Sweden over the Nobel Prize. There was a whole variety of ways in which the United States could say, look, we don't operate that way. We operate differently. And therefore, it's in the interests of most countries, even those in Asia that want to maintain strong relations with China, the Vietnams, the Indonesias, the Japans, the Koreas, even India, that want to maintain ties with China to be closer to the United States. We've just blown that argument away because we're behaving in the way China has behaved for years, as a bullying country using its economic might to push other countries around. So for China, that's a huge strategic win because it just changes the international conversation in their favor. I mean, ironically, China at the moment looks more like a champion of global trade rules than the United States, which is, of course, completely ridiculous because the Chinese have done all sorts of things to undermine the WTO system since they joined in 2001.
Okay, I think we've piled on a little bit on the Trump administration, but what about Congress? Where are they on this? Constitutionally, they should be there, and they've abdicated that authority.
Yeah, there's a tremendous irony here that the historians are going to have a lot of fun with someday, which is that Congress began abdicating its role on trade in the 1930s, but for reasons that trade historians, Mac Destler, the late Mac Destler, wrote about this elegantly, and Doug Irwin's written about it, Doug Irwin's Dartmouth and others, for reasons that seem pretty sound. So if you go back to the last great upsurge of protectionism in U.S. history, the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff, that was all done by Congress, right? That was 2 years of congressional committees and members of Congress saying, this industry in my district wants protection, this industry wants protection. And they put together this big schmozzle mess of a bill, and Herbert Hoover signed the thing. And then in the wake of that, partly because of changes in the makeup of Congress said, look, it's a bad idea. We can't have 435 members of Congress working on the details of tariffs. This really is something that the executive branch needs to have a strategy on, needs to lead. So therefore, we, the Congress, should delegate initially limited authorities to the president to negotiate tariff levels in the United States and around the world, to begin negotiations that would try to reduce other countries' tariffs and gradually reduce our own. And the result was, over the years, Congress abdicated more and more and more of its authority over trade. It was always within a framework. The Congress would pass laws that were intended to constrain the administration in different ways. We've talked about IEPA. That law does not give the president the sort of unlimited power he thinks he has. The same is true on tariffs. What the president is doing now is running roughshod over the authorities that Congress granted the president. But there's nobody in the Congress willing to stand up for the institution's authority. And that's just a real problem under our Constitution, right? You go back to the framers of the Constitution, the whole theory, and we've talked a bit about the courts here, but the whole theory is that the different branches of government would be unwilling to simply hand over their power to another branch, that they would fight to retain that authority. And we have not seen that with this Congress on trade at all. There have been, a few bills introduced. They've gone nowhere. We have a Republican-led Congress that is entirely beholden to President Trump. And I think the only way we get to a position where Congress starts to reassert that authority is if the Trump actions prove economically very damaging. So getting back to our earlier conversation about the economic consequences, if we start to see the economy go into recession, we see real job loss, then I think Congress may say, whoa, we really let the president get away with too much. But for the moment, Congress is completely on its back, and President Trump is running the show, and nobody in Congress is standing up to say he can't do that.
It's really interesting as you go back to history, even the 1930s and Smoot-Hawley, that era was a mercantilist approach. And we are, as a global superpower, using what I perceive as kind of a mercantilist approach to trade, really looking in the rearview mirror. And I think we're just at risk of being marginalized, whether it's by China or just the rest of the world collectively. And so I'm just really nervous that the approach to negotiating these trade deals, whether or not it has short-term benefit, has long-term harm. And that's what keeps me up at night on trade.
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on how far the United States is willing to go. I mean, President Trump has been pretty candid that he liked the old mercantilist economy, right? He thought we were at our greatest in the late 19th and early 20th century when tariffs were generally quite high and there was little or nothing in terms of global trade rules. What we've got today that we've talked about is a far more complex system in which a lot of these rules are still operating day to day, even if the United States is not respecting them when it comes to setting tariff levels. But you have the results of 75 years of negotiation that have built this very complex web of global commerce. In the 1920s and 30s, that whole system was picked apart, right? The global economy collapsed. You look at trade flows in the 1920s and 1930s prior to World War II. Some of that was a consequence of the Great Depression, but a lot of it was a consequence of government actions that set tariff levels so high that international trade simply collapsed. I don't think that this administration is prepared to go that far. I think the current system is bigger and more complex and more robust than the system was in the aftermath of World War II. But all of that is really supposition, right? I mean, governments can break these things. There's nothing inherent in a global economy. There's nothing that says we have to organize ourselves globally with respect to economic interaction. We could all pull back into autarkic national economies if that's what governments want to do. I don't think we're going to go that far. But we're only 6 months into the Trump administration, so I know.
It's amazing it's only been 6 months. I guess, going back to the 1930s, I mean, that essentially didn't work. It contributed to just a tremendous economic downfall. I'm curious, is there any precedent for a power like in the United States? It doesn't even have to be a superpower to impose these across-the-board high tariffs and have it work. Or is this the first attempt for any power to try to do that? Do tariffs work ever?
I mean, yeah, tariffs do work, but we've never seen them in a situation like this. Like, I think the accepted argument for when tariffs have worked is newly emerging economies, growing economies that aren't producing at the level of sophistication of the advanced economies. They want to boost their manufacturing capability. And so they protect their economies in various ways. They set high tariffs to try to develop that capacity. That's what the United States did throughout the 19th century. That's what Canada did for much of the 19th and early 20th century. In the U.S. case, it was to protect ourselves from cheaper and better British manufactured goods. In the Canadian case, it was both American and British manufactured goods. So there is evidence in that kind of situation. A lot of the rise of the Pacific Rim economies, that's what Korea did. That's what Taiwan did. That's what Japan did. So there is a history for that. But we have never seen, and maybe out there among your listeners, someone will correct me if I've missed the history here, but we have never seen a sophisticated advanced economy, arguably the most sophisticated and advanced economy in the world, retreat back into tariffs. There's no economic rationale for that. And a lot of what Trump is talking about is nostalgic, right? The notion that these old manufacturing industries are going to come back and create a lot of jobs in the United States. That isn't what drives our economy anymore. So I think this is really an unprecedented experiment to having the most sophisticated economy in the world going back behind a tariff wall. I don't think we have a blueprint for what happens in that scenario.
Yeah, if I can paraphrase that, it's essentially using a protectionist and even mercantilist approach that tends to work for developing economies as a large economy. So instead
with a lot of caveats, right? It's too long for this conversation. There's lots of cases where tariffs didn't work very well. Look at what happened with Brazil and a lot of Latin America.
Even worse.
But they can work. Tariffs can work in certain circumstances for developing economies. But I really don't have a case to make for how it works for advanced economies.
Right. So we're acting like a developing economy. And if that isn't a retreat from the global order, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I think it is. But I think, Trump would probably argue that, well, the way we've been losing our huge trade deficit, we're behaving like a developing economy, and therefore maybe we should use those tools. Again, I can't find any experts who can make a credible argument for why that would work. But, again, we're gonna get a lot of evidence over the next couple of years about the effects of that approach.
Okay, so just to wrap up, let's assume that you get a call from Donald Trump. And he says, I'm worried that we're starting to look like a protectionist, mercantilist country. Ted, what should I do differently on trade? Give me the bullet points, how you'd advise him.
I think the bullet points are go back. I mean, if you like tariffs and he likes tariffs, fair enough. Use them strategically. Look at those sectors where, for national and economic security reasons, we need to develop domestic capacity, maybe working with our allies. It doesn't all need to be domestic, and maintain tariffs in those places, right? I mean, I can see the argument for tariffs on electric vehicles. It's not great for American consumers, right? We could buy a lot cheaper EVs if we'd import them from China, but it's the leading edge of an important industry. We need to develop a capacity, and you can argue for tariff protection in those places. So pick the industries where we're worried about that. Pick your targets in a careful way. There's certainly lots of cases where tariffs against China are quite warranted. And there may be cases where selected tariffs against other countries are warranted. But this across-the-board approach just raises costs for American consumers, raises costs for our manufacturers. There's no strategic thinking about what are the sectors of our economy that are driving growth and can really matter. Come up with a strategy. Don't just do this by the seat of your pants. He wouldn't listen to me, but that's what I'd tell him.
Well, I hope that he or someone on his staff gives you a call. Ted, this has been a fascinating conversation. I knew I would learn from it. I have, and our listeners are really going to enjoy this.
Great. Fabulous to be with you, Stan. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. Please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend, and be sure to engage with us on social media. Your likes, comments, and reposts make a big difference and help others find the show. The show was produced by Ezra Trupiano, original music by Peter Breinhold, and designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.